Hi everyone. If you can please take your seat. So we continue now with the next session. It's a very interactive one. So please have your devices ready. We're going to be using Padlet. And it's called Strategic Lessons from PathOS. What matters for open science policy? And I invite Tony Ross-Hellauer, who's going to speak and introduce everyone else. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back from coffee. So as Joanna said, my name's Tony. I'm from Graz in Austria, a meta researcher. Lennart will moderate the session today, especially the co-creative parts, and we do intend to make use of your expertise in this session, so please have your devices ready. And then our online moderator is Nicki Cole from my group at No Center, who has also been integrally involved in the work that we'll present, as well as many of the PathOS members who you'll meet over the course of today. So here's the session outline. I'll present first an overview of our methods, although that was discussed already in the session this morning, so I'll go quickly there. And then our findings on the key impact pathways. Then we'll move to our draft recommendations, and we want your inputs and your feedback on those recommendations. The first part of the feedback session will be about recommendations to increase the impact of open science. Then I'll come back to the podium and just present a little bit on the lessons we've learned regarding monitoring, measuring open science impact. And then we'll work on the second part of the recommendations, which will be ways to improve impact evaluation, especially regarding the evidence base and the methods that we're using. Okay, so skip this. The key sources of evidence. So you heard from Joanna this morning. We've done a lot in PathOS today, but the key sources of evidence that we'll draw from are these three scoping reviews. They use the Prisma methodology to systematically scope the scientific literature. They're all available online, and if you go to our website and the Impact Evidence Library, you'll find easy links to get these papers. And then the 6 case studies, some of which were showcased today. And not only 6 case studies, but 2 cost-benefit analyses, which our colleague Silvia Vignetti will present in the following session as well. So we're building on all of these findings to present what we found out regarding what the impact pathways of open science are as far as the evidence goes to date. So defining impact. Impact is long-lasting, elementary, and widespread change. It can be direct or indirect, intended or unintended, and can relate to behavioral and or systemic changes. And in terms of the impacts of open science, we're interested in long-term changes within academia, society, and the economy, resulting from open science activities like open access, fair data, citizen science, and so. Inferring causality in impact evaluation is very difficult, obviously. So Pawson et al. Proposed this concept of generative causality. To infer a causal outcome between 2 events, you need to understand the underlying mechanism that connects them and the context in which that relationship occurs. And so a key question is, what are the causal mechanisms of open science that we would expect to see? Open science is a hybrid coalition. It's made up of divergent voices from very different kinds of stakeholders with very different values, aims, and motives, whether it's grassroots researchers, policymakers, infrastructure providers, or industry players like publishers. Open science is also a kind of a conglomeration of different movements. And so in telling the story of the mechanisms of open science, we can refer to these movements. The philosopher Helen Longino is a social epistemologist, and she distinguishes between three senses of the word knowledge. We can think of knowledge in the form of content, so claims, models, also methodologies, ways of doing. But we can also think of knowledge in terms of sets of practices, the ways that we generate knowledge. And then finally, we can think of knowledge as knowing, that is the agency of a subject having a relation between a claim and a research object. And if we think about these three senses of knowledge, I propose that we can think of three ways that open science is seeking to change the way that we generate knowledge. So first of all, starting at the top, the access mechanism. So open science for me began with open access. And here it was really about making the content of knowledge generation more public, more available. And so the open access movement, and then later the fair data and fair software. And so these movements are concerned with the sharing of outputs. Why? Mainly to unlock value, to boost reuse of that knowledge in order to generate impacts of various kinds. Then we can think of a second movement, probably about 15 years ago. The research integrity movements and the reproducibility movements crystallized. They are much more concerned about the transparency of knowledge, so meaning making scientific processes more interrogable and accountable. Why? Mainly to boost the quality of our research and with downstream effects on the efficiency of the research enterprise. And then finally, we can think of a participation mechanism. So here, this is the extension of knowledge as agency. So boosting how people can be involved in knowledge generation processes, not only researchers, and not only researchers from the non, or increasing participation within the global south, but also increasing participation of who is considered a research actor. So bringing in citizens through citizen science, for example, upstream engagement for policymaking and so. And participation has been heavily linked to equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda, and with downstream effects on relevance and solidarity. So with this in mind, this idea that there are three key mechanisms. So open access, open fair data is about enabling access for reuse, and is the extension of knowledge as content. Transparency is about extending the interrogability of processes and extends knowledge as practice. And participation of actors is about extending knowledge as agency. So what did we find? Here we go. So from those diverse sources of evidence that we showed earlier, this is a high-level diagram of the types of impacts that we found within the PathOS project. So you'll see we have on the left the inputs. This is the resources, the money, the staff, the time. And these are translated into the various forms of open science activities, open access, open fair data, and so on. Okay, so how do these then transfer into outputs, outcomes, and impacts? So if you look on the diagram, the thick dark blue lines, these are where we have fairly robust evidence of effects. And the lighter, thinner blue lines, these are where there's suggestive evidence, but far from conclusive. You'll see that there are a lot more thin blue lines than thick blue lines. So the main finding is, within this study on academic impact, we scoped more than 400, almost 500 papers. And although that might sound a lot, there were big clusters of evidence. especially well researched is the idea of the citation impact of open access outputs, the so-called citation advantage. And this runs here. So open access leads to access to outputs, leads to citations and readership. It's a thick blue line. There is an effect. It's very variable across types of OA and across disciplines. So especially green OA shows this effect more. We also have, via access to outputs, effects on reuse of open and fair data as well as source code. Reuse seems to quite robustly show high levels of efficiency and productivity within academia, but you'll see that this is the only thick blue line for impacts. The long-term impacts of academic impacts of open science really are understudied. We see also that open methods enhance the transparency of processes, and especially that citizen science leads to greater participation of actors and collaboration. Within societal impact, here we studied just under 200 papers, and here we see the majority of this is about citizen science. And therefore, the contributions of citizen science to participation in research, the citizen science community have done a really good job of studying themselves. Most citizen science initiatives seem to study evaluation papers demonstrating, on the one hand, in terms of academic impact, the quality of their data, but also the societal benefits of engagement within citizen science. And so this is having direct effects on democratization of research, knowledge and awareness, social ties and cohesion, and especially on behavioral changes towards health and safety, climate and environment, but also empowerment and equity. And then finally, on the economic impacts of open science, this work done by Sylvia, who you'll see in the next session, it's all about the access to outputs. As we heard in the last session, enabling sharing of outputs leads to, on the one hand, efficiencies in terms of time and cost savings, and enablement in terms of further collaboration and uptake, which can lead to innovation and economic growth. Here, the evidence base is very thin. I think it's 27 papers that we found. So this is heavily understudied, especially when we think back 10, 15 years to how we were all told that open science would be the driver of economic innovation. So overall, the picture is there's not enough evidence to really say definitively what the impacts are. There are lots of positive seeming impacts. There are some unintended consequences, especially negative impacts of APCs on equity and authorship in open access. So then, coming to the first recommendations. So, if you haven't used Padlet before, here's your chance to give it a try. If you have your devices to hand, also works pretty well on a mobile phone, but a laptop might be better. It depends how, I've got quite fat thumbs. So here's the URL if you want to go directly, or the QR code. So it's an interactive collaboration platform. We have here recommendations, and we're inviting you to comment. You add a comment here where it says add comment, or the plus sign at the top. If you can think of a recommendation which we don't have, you can add your own. I'll leave this up for a second, give people a chance. Okay. The URL is still up in the corner. Okay, so the recommendations for boosting impact. So the first is that we need to increase support for the equitable sharing of quality open outputs. I think within the open science movement, we have tended to focus predominantly on sharing of outputs. Sabina Leonelli made this case very clearly in her book 2 years ago. And this isn't enough. Just making things available isn't enough. We heard in the last session how issues of capacity shape the ways that people can take up resources. And the ones with most resources are most often the most empowered to reuse those resources, linking to the themes of AI and the kind of platform logics of open science. So we need to enable people to share amongst all communities, but we also need to ensure the quality of those outputs. A lot of what we're doing at the moment is about getting things online. It's not about the quality of the things that are online. So the second recommendation attend to issues of equity and capacity in reuse. We saw in the Elixir case study, the curation of those data resources is what makes them most valuable to researchers and to industry. So we need a lot more focus on the capacities of reusers. Who wants to reuse these outputs for which purposes, and move from just physical access to meaningful access. So this is not only true in industry, but it's also true in academia, as well as in society. We need to expand efforts to increase transparency, carefully and based on evidence. As I said, the transparency agenda is very heavily comes from the research integrity and reproducibility communities, and these are from very quantitative fields. What the meanings of transparency and the costs and benefits are very different across disciplines. We need to increase support for the diversification of participation in research and scholarship. In the Mentimeter from before, people was one of the things, one of the main things that was flagged as that should matter in measuring impact. And I think that the issues of, or the potential of open science to boost participation, but also the problems of participation within open science, this has been this hasn't been given enough weight up till now. So we need to increase support for the diversification of participation throughout science, whether it's from agenda setting to inquiry to the application of research. And then we need to provide support to enable the openness of proprietary resources. So this tension between the industry's need of intellectual property, and especially in collaboration, in academia industry collaborations and the tensions that this brings, we need a lot more focus here. And Julia Priest-Buchhardt is here from the IP for OS project, which is studying these issues. So, Lennart, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony, first of all, for introducing all the work done and the recommendations as well. So our idea now was, first of all, we can see in the room if there are questions or reactions to this, and then we can also see, we want to also to give a voice to the people online. So please, if you have online any questions or comments, put them in the Zoom chat and also the comments directly in the Padlet. I think we see already some points coming in there. First, maybe in the room, does anybody have a question, a reaction already? I see one person there, and then two over there. Maybe the lady there first. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's more on the increased support for diversification of the participation. I just wanted to ask you what kind of examples of real means do you put together to increase this participation, especially for sectors that are not necessarily academic or classically involved? Thank you.
So I think the evidence that we've seen regarding the efficacy of citizen science, not only as a data source, but also in terms of the education and awareness effects, this is really strong. And there are lots of activities involving publics of all kinds, as well as including industry actors, but also policy actors. And so the maybe aren't necessarily flagged as open science. And so making these practices a lot more visible and meaningful, this is the motivation for this, I think. But also open science, the collaborative aspect of open science, I think has got a bit lost. I do think that we have focused far too much on the sharing of outputs and then on the making those outputs as of high quality through transparency processes, you know. But this is very kind of neoliberal logics. Like open science very often frames itself as radical, but if you see it in terms of on the one hand, commodification of resources, and on the other hand, of kind of transparency as like through the logic of sunlight is the best disinfectant. And this is just very new public management. And so I think that reflecting on Sabina Leonelli's work, especially this recentering people within open science is vital. And so especially maybe rethinking the logics of collaboration and putting that more firmly at the forefront of open science. Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Tony, for presenting this modelization of the data. But I think it's a very interesting model, but it's still somehow linear. And I was wondering, I suppose there are also some feedback loops. Like, for example, we present here empowerment, citizens' empowerment as an outcome of open science, but at the same time, empowerment can lead to more active citizen scientists. So probably there are some circularity and not only a linear, the same for qualitative data as an impact. I suppose if you get more qualitative data, you get also more incentives to share your data, and it's also maybe a feedback loop. So about the general model.
Absolutely. I suppose the impact model is linear. You go from, and so I guess the idea would be that you would piece these together into chains. But the point about the feedback loop and potential amplification effects especially, this is very valuable. I should say that we're working on our final report for PathOS. This should be out just after summer. So yeah, I'll keep this in mind. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, yeah, you had a question, and then the gentleman. Yeah, and okay, maybe you first. I think, can you go first, and then we go to you, and then to you, and then. Yeah.
Okay, so I was in the graph. I couldn't help noticing that like there was no strong arrow pointing to quality. But that said, what's your operational definition of quality there? I mean, you could think of quality as having many dimensions. Perhaps transparency might be a quality in itself. In fact, so what is your definition of quality there to say there is no impact on quality?
The point wasn't that there's no impact on quality. The point was that the evidence is really pretty thin when you think about it.
Yeah,
what do you mean by quality? Studies. So the robustness of results in a broad sense. So the credibility. So not originality, novelty, but more on the robustness.
Yes, and now please you. Yeah.
Great, thanks. A lot of this, especially on the increasing impacts, is still heavy on production. I, as a producer, produce open science artifacts. And on the quality one, we still have an older system of binary. It's in or out of publication as an example. So I'm curious if there's any thoughts on how to do the opposite, increase diversification of how we assess artifacts on a spectrum, because I think that's actually probably the most crucial thing if we really want to think about what on the quality piece. It's not about this is high quality, this is low. It's that there's lots of types of ways to evaluate that. Did that come up at all, or is that something that's associated with this?
In terms of I mean, there were some papers regarding the effect of PubPeer on quality of the results on retractions, and so some, but maybe it wasn't so linked directly to the impact, and therefore it didn't show up for us. But good point, thank you.
Ismail Raffles, Leiden. Well, thanks so much. I really like your comments in terms of the need for more participation in terms of increasing impact. But following from the previous comments, I also thought about in the feedback loop, I'm thinking not just of increasing impact, but actually thinking about the type of impact that it would be relevant. So maybe consumers participation in the shaving machine could improve the shaving machine, but actually patient participation in what type of care you would like. Say, maybe we need less of the treatment and more of a healthcare systems. So whether you have had discussions along these lines of thinking about the type of impact, and this is particularly relevant in the Global South, where many of the potential impacts are not realized because research is not invested in the types of contents that might have an impact. Right?
Okay, thank you. Was there a question, Ismail? Sorry.
Well, I suppose this is, if you allow me, this is a critique of the way the European Commission framed the project, which was showing the impact, rather than thinking, well, what are the types of impact that would be societally beneficial? The reversing of the question, not more impact, but what type of impacts can be better achieved with a science that is in dialogue with society?
Okay, excellent point. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll make a note, and I don't have an immediate response apart from yes.
Yeah, but maybe if I can say a few words about this as well, that of course, I mean, if you do a policy for open science, you should think about like, what do you want to achieve and how? And I think our project, I mean, it's in the end, it's a bit of a starting point to actually figure out how it can be proved that there are impacts or not in some area, because we also see policies and maybe promise there will be more equity, there will be more access, etc. But it's very difficult to prove that. And what are the ways and mechanisms, what are the methods and approaches to test that in order to later on look back into, for example, to evaluate the policies or to evaluate a project or infrastructure, as we heard before, and actually to show that beyond the aspiration that open science produces societally benefits, but actually that you think about this in the beginning, that, okay, we have some evidence emerging now how to get there, but it's a difficult road ahead still, I think. Yeah. Should we also check maybe online? Are there any questions from online?
Thanks, Lennart. Can you hear me okay? Yes. We have a question submitted by Fiona Bradley, who writes, "Good evening from Australia. Is there a need to incentivize industry to contribute back to the costs and capacities to create a sustainable open science ecosystem? Making note that many countries outside Europe lack adequate funding of research by government that change the dynamics here." An important question.
While you're online, Nicki, do you want to answer that? I should say Nicki has been a key part of this work.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, I guess we have to consider how is science and open science being financed. On the one hand, companies are supposed to pay tax, right? Which should contribute to the financing of science. So perhaps they already are, and that would be, thinking from the input side of what inputs start to create open science impact pathways. I don't know if that work has been done or not. We didn't do that within this project, but that seems an important empirical question to answer. So generally speaking, yes, I think they should be contributing, but I think we need to understand what are they already contributing, and if that's not considered adequate in some way, what more would be adequate. But I think that raises a lot of knock-on questions, right, of how you would establish that and what kinds of contributions should take place where and through what channels. Perhaps the other panelists would like to respond.
Yeah, open science has always kind of been in tension with industry, right? Because if you think of the European Commission, on the one hand, in its programs, it really wants, so much of it is applied, and it really wants to drive participation of industry within projects. Then on the other hand, it wants open science. So you end up with exceptions like for data sharing in terms of reasons of intellectual property that you could drive a bus through, and very weak. It's not like companies need to prove that there is an economic reason why they can't share data in a certain way in order to not share data within projects. And we know that especially as research becomes more applied and more mission-driven, I mean, economic growth, although kind of, I don't understand how it can just go on forever unless we escape to Mars. It does have benefits for us all, right? And so in terms of the idea of research as an engine of the economy is very well ingrained, and it does benefit us as researchers because it pours money into our into funding lines. But I do think that there is maybe a question of the role, at least in publicly funded research, of industry players and the extent to which they should be expected to give back resources. I should also note I was at the Meta Science conference last week, where someone from Google DeepMind was on the panel. And somebody asked a question about what they are giving back to open science. And that conversation was shut down by the rector of UCL, who I think is also a DeepMind collaborator. And it is obvious, like with large language models, they've become such big news in the last couple of years. And it always struck me that this was the economic innovation that was promised, like in meetings 10, 15 years ago, when policymakers were saying that data is the new oil and everybody was talking about, text and data mining. LLMs are exactly what they were foreseeing. And who is benefiting most? As we said, because of kind of the platform logics of so much of online activity, and the resource intensity of these kind of technologies, the one who are in the position to benefit most are the big players with the most resources. So I think that this also kind of brings our attention back to participation processes and enabling, and especially our values of enabling open research infrastructures and shared resources and open source to mean that everybody can benefit maximally.
Yeah, we're being asked to look at the Padlet as well, which is now on screen. I think also for everybody in the room here, so we're looking for now for the next couple of minutes mainly at the left column on the increasing impact, because then we will go into, I mean, Tony will talk through the other two groups of the recommendations as well. And I see there are already a lot of comments. I'm not sure if there's any specific questions in there, so it's a bit difficult to say. There's questions about what is equitable, of course. I don't know if you have thoughts on to start with. There's quite a lot discussion, of course, and I think that's also a topic now in Europe as well. We know it as the European Research Area Policy Agenda for the Europeans here has picked that up as a topic. So there's probably some work going into that in the future as well. But do you have thoughts about what does equitable mean, or how do we get there?
Well, I mean, in terms of equitable sharing, if you just think about, just in terms of equitable sharing, think of the capacities that are needed in order to share. It shouldn't be taken for granted or taken as given. There's so much resources that go into enabling researchers to be able to share and to share well. So, for example, in open access publishing, models of open access which expect the authors to pay fees are having effects of stratification on who publishes where, which we know. In terms of sharing data, is everybody in the same position to share data? If people have questions about the extent to which they will be credited for their work because they come from the global south, for example, then should they be penalized for not sharing, or should we maybe accept that there are some limits to openness. It's not an unalloyed good. It's maybe a heuristic. Generally, yes, open, better, maybe, not in all circumstances and all times. So this, where we talk about equity here, and I should say that these recommendations will kind of give explainer text with them, but these are the concepts of equity that we're dealing with in that case.
Okay, are there any more comments here in the room? I think we have some more time. I see Natalia. Yes, please.
Okay, on the topic of equitable access, so I hear from the audience here that we are talking about equitable commitments. Okay, and we had a chat in the corridor with some people before. So I was thinking is that, you know, do we treat publications, data, and software the same? Because to me it's not the same, because there is value. And then about equitable commitment from public and private partnerships, where would recommendations for open science be? You know, at which level? Would it be at the level of, you know, sharing costs, sharing resources, sharing content, services? This is the kind of things that maybe we want to see in PathOS.
Okay. Regarding commitments in public-private partnerships, I don't really have a view. Do you have a view, Natalia?
I have a view, okay, and I think the view is that the open science community really need to discuss this and come up with, you know, what we want these public-private partnerships to look like, and we haven't entered this discussion.
Okay. And what was the first point, sorry?
So it's two things, is that the way we see open science, and I haven't read the PathOS recommendations, is that, you know, publications, research data and software and others should, I think I have the suspicion that they should not be treated the same, because there are different enablers or different challenges. Mm-hmm. And then the commitments is the public-private partnerships is in what terms do we want it to happen in order to have open science and impact of open science.
Okay, I see what you said. Yeah, so the model there was just very high level, just to reduce the complexity. And yeah, I agree that the enablers and also the readiness for sharing, the challenges, and also the reuses are very different. Yeah.
Okay, I think I would like to go maybe to one point that I see in, that's for Teresa, the recommendation 1E on support to enable openness of proprietary resources. And there are some questions, it's quite interesting there. 1E, please, if you scroll down a bit more. You can see them as well.
Yeah, I've got
it. Okay, so there's, for example, the question, what does it mean? Like, how do we get actors that would want to keep proprietary findings closed? Of course, this is, again, I mean, this is, like, let's say, my small comment here, that even open access resources, even if they're open access licensed, CC BY, they're still kind of proprietary, right? I mean, it's still the property of something, it's just openly licensed. So it's a bit of the question, what do we mean? We mean probably closed resources here. No? So that is, but how do we incentivize that, I think, is a good question. I don't know if you have reactions to that or someone in the room.
I was just going to invite Sylvia, because Sylvia wrote this recommendation.
Please, Sylvia.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
Sorry, the question, what does it mean? I mean, this is, do not most actors who are not opening resources want to keep them closed? So I think there's a question of what incentives could there be to improve that?
Yes, now one point is, as we're discussing, one of the Can you hear me? Okay. Now, there is a point on where we, I mean, the openness, as we said, being open helps because increase the collaboration, increase the possibility for science and industry to collaborate. At a certain point, the private users comes in, and they of course use open data for innovation, for example, as we saw in the economic impact pathway. And of course, they need to have an incentive at a certain point to close their knowledge and to appropriate the economic value of what they do with this knowledge. Now, attention is there on where the openness should end and where the closeness should come in, and the fact that openness is a bit tricky for the evaluation process, because openness goes together with not being tracked. As we were discussing later this morning, it goes also to the point of who is paying for that. So who is benefiting and then who is paying, and if those that are benefiting are paying in an equitable way. So if they are paying for what they really get there. So if we think about the case study on the COVID, showed quite clearly the fact that it was open accelerated a lot and improved the way in which research was made during the COVID to get some vaccines there. And then the industry come in and of course develop the vaccines, and they earned billions with what they could do with the vaccine. So of course there's a problem there on where the openness should end and where the industry and how they can contribute. Now, I do not have the answer on how to solve this problem, but I think this is a core problem there. And so we need to find some frameworks, some schemes that can help in saying what kind of research should be open, and if the private and the industry participates in certain type of publicly funded resources, they need to maintain the results open to everybody because they benefited with public money.
Yep, thank you. And there's one more, okay, and then I think you want, please, and then I think we move to the next part of the session after that.
I would complement what Cecilia was mentioning, just remembering that the tax system, corporate tax system, is far from perfect, and may just remind that very recently the big tech, the tech giants, have been exempted by the treaty about the minimum tax. So the implications of this is that we cannot be confident that the flow of information that goes from open science to closed science, patents, profits, is fairly going back to the taxpayer.
Okay, thank you. And I think also thank you to everyone who already put a lot of comments there in the Padlet as well. I think that's quite useful to refine and reflect on the recommendations after. So Tony, you are now going to just walk us through the second and third block of recommendations, and then we can have a bit more discussion on those. And yeah, please keep putting questions in the Zoom for those who are online, and please also keep commenting on the Padlet. But Tony?
So we'll move back to the PowerPoint. So in this next part, we will reflect on what PathOS learned about how advanced we are in terms of measuring, monitoring the impact of open science. Thank you, Teresa. Okay, so in terms of lessons learned and the evidence base at the moment, so the first thing we can say, of those studies that we found, this was quite a small amount compared to the number of studies and advanced infrastructures for measuring the uptake of open science. So what we can say is that especially policymakers in terms of the national open science monitors, for example, have been very keen to track whether their policies are being effective. Effective in the sense of we want more people to do open access, therefore count the number of open access publications each year. Want more people depositing data sets, count data sets. But to go back to the point about why we want to open science in these various ways, we do that because we want it to have societal value. We want to work for collective benefit. We want to raise quality and enable reuse. So far, we've focused far too much on monitoring uptake and not enough on monitoring or measuring or evaluating the impacts. And the impacts are really what matters, because we want to know whether open science works or not. The second is that there is just a general lack of evidence, and it's worth reflecting on the reasons for that. So I think maybe policymakers have feel a very strict responsibility to report back whether policies are working just in very narrow and quick terms in terms of year-on-year increase in open science practices. And the actual evidence of impact is very often, most of the studies that we found came from research teams. So it's the evidence base is very bottom-up and very patchy for that reason. So there's uneven coverage across types of open science activities, uneven coverage across disciplines, and uneven coverage across the globe. There is an overemphasis on citations. Here, we can link this to the next point, the streetlight effect. We have very robust infrastructures for measuring citations. They have problems of inclusivity and global equity, as we know, but they are very robust, and you can go into a database and rub some data together and get some results fairly efficiently and publish fairly efficiently. And so in terms of the open access citation advantage maybe being overstudied, I think this is a key reason for that. So we need to move beyond citations to more basic measures of impact. And we need to stop measuring what's easy to measure and start looking for what's important. Some evidence skew and bias, because a lot of this is bottom-up reporting, and a lot of it is from initiatives involved in open science, reporting on their own activities, so especially in citizen science, for example. But I think, and there's got to be some studies here, the evidence of publication bias within the meta-science community, I think we're not eating our own dog food in terms of publishing null and negative results. So we need better reporting of things that don't work as well as those that do. We could do more in terms of linking up our evaluation efforts and working on shared frameworks for that. And here we'll hear, especially tomorrow, and about the role of OSME here. Missing links to policy and practice, and then infrastructure and capacity gaps. In terms of our methods, this battery is going through. Could you forward the slide? Yeah, thank you. So open science practices are evolving, and maybe our methods lag a bit behind them. So we still don't have highly robust ways of tracking reuse of data, for example, and much less for other types of open science practices. Timing issues. So very often we're working on project timescales, and maybe we're missing early stage and long-term impacts. There's the issue that was discussed earlier about weak causal analysis. In general, once you get downstream from inputs to activities all the ways through to impact, because it's so downstream and long-term, establishing causality is very, very difficult. And there's also the issue of often a lack of counterfactual. So if the counterfactual for reuse of open data isn't closed data, for example, then we could do more in terms of finding shared vocabularies for impact assessment, as well as increasing reporting standards. So there's an initiative underway, for example, within the bibliometrics community to create reporting guidelines. And in a lot of the citation studies we found, there were very highly variable methods. There's a predominance of case studies, which isn't a problem, but there is then the issue of generalizing across these case studies. There's poor integration of interdisciplinary methods. Impact assessment very often requires quantitative and qualitative methods. Fragmented data and inconsistent tracking, and the problem of standard and emerging metrics. So here we go. So back to Padlet, if you already have it open. I'll just see if anybody's still typing.
I think it's okay. I see many people in the Padlet.
I see 2 people with their phones up.
Okay. Maybe they were taking a picture.
Back. Yeah, slides, please. I meant they should go back to Padlet, not us. Okay. So the next set of recommendations, in terms of improving our evidence bases, we need to increase the resources and the support for impact studies. So some dedicated streams of funding for this, longer term and larger. We need to move the focus in investigations from uptake to impact. To me, impact, the downstream effects, this is what we should be measuring. We need to define key evidence gaps. Those should be developed by key stakeholders. So key infrastructures, policymakers, publishers, sets of researchers in various disciplines should work to define the key evidence gaps that they see. We should share this in order to maybe help prioritize studies more in a more coordinated way. Study more open science interventions, so just not open access and citizen science, different types of outcomes, especially on equity, reuse, effects on quality, and as I say, go beyond what's easy to measure. We need to more explicitly encourage the documentation of our failures and not only our successes. And we need to accept a diversity of evidence, meaning establishing impact requires very often mixed methods, qualitative evidence, not only quantitative indicators. And so, yeah, we need to find ways to integrate these in a more holistic way. And then thank you. Then we need to regularly review the indicators and metrics that we are using to account for evolving technologies and practices. We should encourage open science initiatives to collect data from when they start. It's a lot easier to begin collecting data at the start rather than in hindsight. We should design evaluations with longer follow-up periods or rolling tracking to capture delayed effects of open science. Take greater care and with impact study methods and design. Combine a variety of different methods. We should encourage independent investigations across initiatives instead of individual case studies. Support the development and implementation of reporting guidelines relevant to specific disciplines, and we need to support open research infrastructures to enable equitable access to the data relevant to impact assessment. So with that, I think maybe we give another minute or two to complete and then...
Yes, yep. Indeed, we're collecting, comments on the Padlet again, questions. Can look in the room if there's already somebody who has a comment. And I see first lady in the back, and then we move forward. Okay, please.
Can you hear me?
Can you speak up just a little bit, maybe?
Okay, Nabila Sadisu from Open Science Community Nigeria. Thank you, Tony, for this extremely hard work. In specifically Nigeria, for example, where open science is still emerging. So there's many institutions and communities are just not underrepresented in global evidence, but they are like structurally excluded from shaping it. How can we ensure that countries like us, Nigeria, are not only participants in studies like that, but actually help define the key evidence gap, and that non-traditional form of evidence, including community narratives, oral case study, and all these hybrid knowledge systems, are formally accepted in global open science? Thank you.
Many thanks. Excellent question. In terms of being included in the design, I would just flag the Open Science Monitoring Initiative and the global approach that's being taken there. I don't know if you're already part of those working groups.
Yes, I'm the co-chair of one of the groups.
My apologies.
Lots to talk, lots to talk.
But making sure that there's the diversity of voices, including in those conversations about the design, maybe more funding, which is directed towards those contexts. And this, I think, could be added to our draft recommendations, definitely. But it's difficult because the ones who are most advanced, who've led the conversation, are probably in the best place to monitor and measure as well. So, but I think that going back to the principles of open science in terms of especially focusing first on logics of participation in those conversations and then constructing out from there, making sure that we further our work on open research infrastructures in order to enable sharing of data. And your point about the sharing of community narratives, I think, is really, really important. The power of narrative when it comes to impact cannot be underestimated. I think there's a tension because we want knowledge to be generalizable and not always case study specific. So there's a bit of a tension. Ismail was part of a blog, I think last year, which talked about ways to generalize case study evidence. And I think that this was a very interesting suggestion as well. So yes, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have one question there, please.
So this question is coming from a society publisher perspective, having also just come from the MetaScience conference last week, where a lot of funders spoke to how they're thinking about this kind of evaluation and deciding what to fund. Given the role of global funders in pushing these practices, mandating them, to what extent should funders be doing this kind of assessment? I mean, these are very expensive mandates. And I'm curious to what extent you're having conversations or have thought about that at all. Obviously, there's a rich community here doing this, but shouldn't the funders as well?
Yes, but I mean, institutions are also putting a lot of money behind as well. I think that the funders are. If you look at the open science monitoring initiatives, which have already been springing up, these have been led by funders, but very often again, we need to remember open science is a hybrid coalition. stakeholders have their own standpoints and motivations. And so if you leave it to the funders, they might be looking for what's the return on investment so that they can tell the people that they answer to about what open science is doing. So yeah. Would you have a response to your question?
I think I'm just reflecting on the network effects around that, because from a publisher perspective, if you're negotiating with a Netherlands consortium or the German consortium, they're asking you, how much are you enabling compliance with these mandates? And as a publisher, you're trying to figure out how to do that, how to invest in that. At the same time, you're seeing a lot of data that's showing it's not quite having the effect it needs to have yet. How do you decide where to make those investments, knowing that there's a customer base that's sort of insisting you do this, even though it's, in the US at least, we don't have the government funding it in the same way. So that's where the question's coming from. Thank you, Tony.
Yep, and there was a question. Yep, please.
Yeah, just two remarks. The first one is just a little bit jumping on the anecdote that you told us about the big tech, and it's more about the meaning of open, because obviously we have open AI, but it's not to understand the same way. It's not so open, and it has its own bias. So do you think we need a little bit of a protection of the word open that is associated so that we can put more structure on it? And the second question is more about the indicators. I think you put it, and it's very important to review indicators to have their relevance, but who has the legitimacy to review that? Obviously, there are coalitions, as you have said, there are people who are knowledgeable, but is it enough, or do you think there are other stakeholders?
Thank you so much. So, I mean, your question about open AI, of course, this goes back to the open washing question from before, obviously. And I mean, we can't copyright the word open and exclude people from using it. I've been reflecting, so this idea of open science as a hybrid coalition, and especially having different constituencies who want different things. Like I do think that the people who came via reproducibility or research integrity are very focused on transparency. First, the people who came from FAIR are about enabling access for reuse. And this can lead to some disconnects. Like I think that the European Open Science Cloud, for instance, hasn't really taken advantage of the role that it could have in the reproducibility debate, for example. But I think it's also a strength. So there's this notion in social science of a boundary object, which is where diverse communities, they don't mean exactly the same thing, but nonetheless, they can use it in such a way as to enable efficient communication. And open science, I mean, like it just functioned as this kind of umbrella under which these diverse groups who wanted different things, whether it's enabling participation of publics or enabling transparency of equality or enabling sharing of outputs, they could gather and gain momentum, and it's definitely gained momentum. To a certain extent, your question could have been posed at any time, and it was posed 5 years ago with the start of the UNESCO definition, for example. But that hasn't really solved the debate, you know? And so I think we can be more... we've moved into a phase where I started 10 years ago as a full open science, drink the Kool-Aid advocate, open good. And we've definitely moved beyond that phase. I think we're still in a phase of finding out what the effective or situational limits of open science are, and making that clearer. For example, in relation to debates about intellectual property or so, making that clearer would enable us to be a lot clearer in saying this isn't open science and this is, I think.
Okay, I see one question in the room, and then maybe someone online can let us know if there's a question there, but yeah.
Yes, you mentioned the umbrella term that's kind of vague, and I very much agree. You said this is positive to gain momentum, but isn't there sometimes negative consequences of the umbrella term as well, in terms of like people perhaps would be very in favor of something very specific within the open science umbrella, actually getting scared because of the whole rest of the thing. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of people with the Brazilian government who advocate for open science, but say you shouldn't use open because open will scare this and this and this person. So say collaborative or say transparent or say something. So I'm not sure we really reflect on that, and just wanted to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it goes back to the point about definition again. Like just being clearer about what it is that we expect open science to be able to achieve, and understanding that some of those things, like the societal impact, will very often be predicated upon just the availability of resources. So just being clearer about which aspects of openness we are talking about, for which purposes, I think would help a lot with that. But at the same time, it is a good brand, apart from if you're in the humanities and you speak English. But yeah.
Is there another question? Over there.
Thank you. My name is Paul from Kenya. Thank you for the conversation. I have one question, probably one comment. When it comes to, there's so much conversation about infrastructure. I have to admit that yes, we have so much information, and especially in the global south, we have so much information, but the infrastructure is lacking. So probably as part of your recommendation, you can consider having context specifics so that as you give the recommendation on how to improve the infrastructure, we can have more context specifics in that. Now, the second, which is more of a question, and also there's a question or a comment that has been raised that if we keep on reviewing the matrix, some will be very far, while others will start will be at the base. I like the three pillars that you have when you're measuring the impact. They're very clear. But on this, when you're designing the indicators, and one of the recommendations you have is there's need to keep reviewing the indicators. So could there be a possibility of probably having a base indicator that say like base indicator 1.0, so that as you keep on changing, those who are starting or who are at the beginning stage will not struggle to catch up with others, but will have a base indicator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It is definitely a problem in open science that basically the way it seems to me to have gone is that the Netherlands and the UK gallop ahead and set the agenda. This year we're concentrating on this year we're concentrating on this, and that many countries, also that we might think of as relatively rich, are very often struggling to catch up. And in setting new standards for this, in this example, for this is how we should measure, then they do just throw new obstacles in the way of countries trying to catch up. I'm not sure about the idea of having a base metric, because I think the point is more that there should be a variety of metrics or indicators, as well as qualitative evidence that all adds to the picture of the impacts of open science. And I would be afraid that if there was one indicator, then this might distort incentives in unexpected ways. Thank you.
Is this working? Hello. Ian Thranaskevich from PLOS. So I left something like this comment on one of the columns. And maybe this is also my attempt for some happy news before lunch. Sort of reflecting on, I'm imagining there'll be a document, a paper with some recommendations on, and there's often a sort of style to these where we sort of imply that there's a lot that needs to improve, and here's how we can do it, and here are all the things that are wrong. I'm wondering, with these different recommendations and all of the amazing work that you've done, like, can you talk to like examples of success? Like, here is something that is actually exemplifying at least some of what we're looking for. Yeah, will you talk about, show us what success looks like, or at least in a specific context with how you go forward with this?
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is my fault that this didn't come across.
I mean, we do have more sessions. We have an entire session on the CBA as well, which I think is very interesting, at least applied to certain case studies, for example. So I think, I mean, we didn't do evaluation of specific policies really throughout the entire project, but within PathOS, I think these case studies are quite good examples of, yeah, how these, in this case, very often, like infrastructures created certain impacts, or the communities around them as well. So I think that's the other part of the story. I saw also in the Padlet many discussions about the diversity of evidence that, of course, we was already, alluded to, that often there is like a mix of qualitative and quantitative work in terms of, sometimes you need to talk to people to know how they engage with their community about a certain resource that then like crystallized a lot of, reuse, for example, because people just don't go to a website. They like to be engaged if there's a specific benefit for them. But I think that maybe one of the next sessions that will be covered a bit better. Or do you have any other examples now, Tony? I mean, I gave you a bit of time to think about it.
I mean, open access is having an effect that we wanted. It's being used more than otherwise. And there is at least one or two studies that show that it's being used in more diverse contexts, as well as citizen science is working, It is generating data which very often we wouldn't have access to. That data is of high scientific quality, and the people involved are benefiting. There are always problems, and I guess the thing about these kind of meetings is it's like setting the standard and saying this is where we need to go next. And I guess in terms of recommendations, maybe the first recommendation will be give yourself a pat on the back, but then after that we'll say that. But thanks, Ian. I think it's important that we don't frame it in the way that, open science isn't achieving at least a good deal of what it sets out to.
Are there any other questions, or should we discuss among us a few more things? Anybody online? I think still, no, I think people edit also recommendations, so thank you for that. We'll try to fit them in some way or another.
Just to say, Lennart, there's no questions online at this moment.
Can we wrap it up? It's lunchtime, looking at the master of ceremony.
Ioana, are we allowed to leave?
Or should we?
Yes. So thank you first for leading this difficult session. I'm very glad I wasn't up there. But if people have questions that they think PathOS should have answered, please track me down and let me know. And we'll write them down. And also the Padlet will remain open. So please go add your thoughts and so on. So we'll move to lunch until 2 p.m. and where we'll start talking about the Handbook of Indicators and the CBA. Thank you so much.